Today, knowledge of East Germany, formerly known as the German Democratic Republic, is rapidly fading from the minds of the younger generation. But, for decades after the end of the Second World War, East Germany served as a stark symbol of both Cold War tension and division, hidden behind the dreaded Iron Curtain. In 1989, this repressive and controversial regime was celebrating its 40th anniversary with elaborate parades on its flag-adorned streets. Underneath the glamour, however, laid brewing troubles that were about to trigger the dramatic end of East Germany and the subsequent German reunification. Chiefly amongst these troubles was the economy. For years, the East German economy had been steadily deteriorating. Their once reliable access to cheap Soviet energy was drastically reduced as the USSR faced its own economic crisis, severely affecting East Germany's energy-intensive industries. At the same time, mounting foreign debt, driven by a growing dependence on loans and credit from Western countries, especially West Germany, placed further strain on the GDR's financial stability. Meanwhile, systemic inefficiencies inherent in the centrally planned economy led to chronic mismanagement, resulting in widespread shortages of consumer goods and declining public confidence. There was also, of course, prevalent discontent stemming from the East German government's authoritarian methods, which brutally and near completely suppressed political opposition. The infamous East German Stasi, which stands for Ministry for State Security in German, conducted overwhelming surveillance on the population, which, while unspoken, was well known amongst the people, who lived day to day knowing that they were constantly being watched. Another source of grievance was the East German policy of allowing limited travel to West Germany, which created further inequality and dissatisfaction, as only selected citizens could benefit. The consequences of this disparity were deeply corrosive, and stories and glimpses of the West, whether from West German television broadcasts or conversations with those lucky enough to travel, fed a growing sense of alienation and yearning. Young people, in particular, became increasingly cynical about the promises of socialism, seeing instead a system that denied them opportunity and demanded conformity. As more East Germans became aware of their regime's failures, the foundations of state legitimacy weakened. Perhaps East Germany could have survived much longer with its near impenetrable state apparatus, provided that it had the backing of its allies, namely the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. However, sweeping changes had occurred both in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc as a whole. In 1985, the position of General Secretary had been passed from the elderly Konstantin Chernenko, who only served for a little more than a year, to the much younger, reformist-minded Mikhail Gorbachev. A year into his tenure in 1986, Gorbachev announced the policies of perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. These were aimed at revitalizing the stagnating Soviet system from within, both economically and politically. Perestroika sought to decentralize economic planning and introduce limited market mechanisms, while glasnost encouraged transparency, freedom of expression, and greater public debate. The result was a dramatic upheaval of the political and social status quo. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens experienced a loosening of state censorship, press freedom, and the right to criticize the government. These changes reverberated throughout the USSR as well as its satellite states, leading to Eastern Bloc countries looking to enact their own similar reforms. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev, with his so-called Sinatra Doctrine, which allowed Eastern Bloc countries to determine their own domestic policies, decided not to interfere. While other Eastern Bloc countries received perestroika and glasnost with enthusiasm, for Erich Honecker, General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party, which governed East Germany, the reforms Gorbachev was advocating for were simply too much. Honecker, a staunch hardliner, believed that they would not only destabilize the government, but would also ruin the socialist system he firmly believed in. In a move that clearly showed the disintegration of Soviet-East German partnership, Honecker's government began censoring both Soviet publications and speeches by Gorbachev in a bid to keep reformist ideas out of East Germany, but to no avail. Honecker's refusal to implement any reforms like those enacted by surrounding Eastern Bloc countries caused outrage and eventually public protest led by East Germany's intellectuals, artists, and church representatives in the late 1980s. Crackdowns on the protesters only led to outcomes opposite to what the party hoped for. Specifically, it led to a myriad of other interest groups feeling the need to join the protests. These included environmentalists, anti-nuclear activists, and many others, all with the common goal of producing change in East Germany. Then came May 1989, when Hungary began dismantling its border fences with Austria, and soon after, the communist government there collapsed. Not only was this event seen as a signal that the end of the Eastern Bloc was coming, but many East Germans also began flooding into Hungary in hopes of crossing over to the West or applying for asylum with the West German embassy in Budapest. In August, East Germans who had taken refuge in embassies were permitted to move westward, setting off a mass exodus that saw thousands more flee the GDR and abandon the Eastern Bloc. In East Germany, this sparked intense political debate within families, on public transport, and in workplaces. Pro-democracy groups were formed, including New Forum, Democracy Now!, and Democratic Awakening. Now, protests were no longer isolated or spontaneous acts. Dissidents began to organize collectively, giving rise to a mass movement later known as the Peaceful Revolution. However, as the movement unfolded, it was not always entirely peaceful, and some demonstrations still led to violent confrontations between protesters and state authorities. Courageous individuals began to test the limits of public expression and organization. An East German later recalled the following experience. On October 3rd, at approximately 5:15 p.m., he exited the delicatessen and stepped into Pernos Market Square. There, driven by frustration and long-held anger, he began shouting, "Down with Honecker! Honecker, you rascal! Give the little children bananas! And we want free elections!" What stood out to him, however, was that many bystanders shouted, "Leave the man be, he's speaking the truth." In September the following month, regular weekly pro-democracy demonstrations began across towns and cities across the country. They are referred to as Monday demonstrations, as that was the day they occurred in Leipzig, where they started. But they were staged on several days of the week. The protesters called for an open border with West Germany, genuine democracy, and greater human rights and environmental protections. As protests intensified in East Germany, the regime escalated its repressive tactics. Further crackdowns were coordinated, and the security forces were armed and prepared for physical confrontation. Stasi officers were also instructed to arrest anyone distributing oppositional literature and to take, quote, offensive measures to block and disrupt conspiratorial assembly. Then, on October 5th, Stasi chief Erich Milke issued his infamous order, announcing, "Enemy negative activities are to be decisively prevented by any means. Allow no surprises. Allow the opponent no opportunity to undertake activities on the assumption that we are not present." Despite the stern commands coming from some segment of the government, it became apparent that disagreements were emerging on the method with which protesters should be dealt with. Indeed, a number of senior officials began urging a more nuanced response to the growing unrest. Colonel General Rudi Mittig of the Stasi, for example, proposed that more attention be paid to understanding the sources of discontent, warning that treating all outgoing immigrants and opposition supporters as enemies was ultimately counterproductive. Indeed, these departures from the prevailing hardline position reflected a declining confidence in the effectiveness of blanket repression. This was also indicative of the growing internal awareness of the worsening state of the Socialist Unity Party and the broader state apparatus. By July of 1989, an internal party report had already exposed widespread dissatisfaction within their ranks, including a notable reluctance to view the West as the class enemy. Additionally, reports compiled by the Stasi in September noted that uncertainty, confusion, and resignation were mounting amongst party members and state employees. The top leadership's callous response to the mass exodus of citizens in mid-1989 further deepened the crisis. Rather than addressing the causes, they adopted an attitude of indifference, what many interpreted as a stance of good riddance. This not only alienated ordinary citizens, but also stunned those within the system. Some party members even chose to emigrate themselves, while many more responded by leaving the party. By early October that year, resignations had reached 100,000. Even members of the Central Committee expressed a sense of abandonment, feeling left in the lurch by those at the top. In the end, the erosion of morale and faith in the state was not limited to the population, but had penetrated the institutions responsible for defending the regime, which left even the most loyal organs of the state, such as the Stasi, uncertain of their role. One of the key events during the peaceful revolution was the protest during what was supposed to be the celebration of East Germany's 40th anniversary on October 7, 1989. With Gorbachev in attendance, the crowds cried out his nickname, Gorby, and asked him to save them. That night, 1,500 protesters near the Gethsemane Church in Prenzlauer Berg, Berlin, came under brutal repression by security forces, attacking protesters and making some 500 arrests. Other protests outside of the Palace of the Republic were also met with the same treatment. The following day, on October 8th, Erich Honecker and Stasi chief Erich Milke ordered the implementation of Plan X, a long-prepared operation to arrest and indefinitely detain over 85,000 East Germans during a state of emergency. The plan would have converted prisons, schools, hospitals, and even holiday hostels into internment camps, targeting dissidents, peace activists, and anyone previously under surveillance. Fortunately, when Milke issued the final orders, codenamed SHIELD, local Stasi officers refused to act, fearing mass retaliation like the lynchings of secret police in Hungary in 1956. Many officers instead fortified their stations and planned to hide until the end of the unrest. Ten days later, on October 18, 1989, Erich Honecker was finally voted out of his office by party officials, in an ugly falling out between him and Erich Milke. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, a fellow hardliner who congratulated the Chinese government on their crackdown of the Tiananmen Square demonstration. The protesters were doubtful that Krenz was the one who would bring along the changes they demanded, but they wouldn't have to find out. The rule of the Socialist Unity Party was over, and the writing was on the wall. On November 7th, the entire East German cabinet, comprised of 44 council members, resigned. With the government in disarray and a substantial portion of their population long gone, there was nothing the East German government could do to keep their people in anymore. On November 9th, party official Günter Schabowski announced that people were allowed to leave the country freely through checkpoints along the Berlin Wall and the border. By 11:30 the same day, 20,000 people had arrived at the Bornholmer Strasse border crossing at the Berlin Wall, where Stasi officer Harold Jaeger opened the very first gate along the entire border, and people flooded through. When night came, Germans on both sides, no longer caring about the distinction of East or West, started breaking down the Berlin Wall with anything they could get their hands on, and covering it in graffiti. On December 3rd, like the cabinet members, Egon Krenz, along with the rest of the Politburo and Central Committee, also resigned. Then, on October 3rd, 1990, East Germany was formally dissolved, and so was West Germany, merging to form the modern Germany as we know it today. In the aftermath of the collapse of East Germany, many of its officials and agents would be tried for their involvement in the deaths of around 140 people who lost their lives trying to cross the Berlin Wall. However, a great many of these individuals went without punishment, although today, their crimes and repression are on clear display across Germany's museums and archives, forever etched in history, as a reminder of both the immense suffering and the triumph of human spirit in one of the Cold War era's last chapters. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you or anyone you know have memories of this turbulent time in history, please feel free to share them in the comments. Additionally, please like and subscribe if you would like to see more videos on Cold War related topics. Your support is deeply appreciated. See you next time.